And so if you'll just take a deep breath and just connect to yourself, to the higher self within you. Om Gajananam Bhutaganadisevitam Kapithajambhufalasarabhakshitam Umasutam Shokavinashakaranam Namami Vigneshwarapadapangajam. Om Shri Mahaganapataye Namaha. Shadananam Kunkumaraktavarnam Mahamatim Divyamayuravahanam Rudrasya Sunam Surasainyanatham Guham Sadaham Sharanam Prapadye. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada. Om Namo Bhagavate Dhanvantaraya Murtaye Amrita Kalasha Hastaya Sarvamaya Vinashanaya Trailokyanataya Shri Mahavishnave Swaha. All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me in this last lecture. By no means are 3 lectures adequate to cover jyotish, as many of you have already gathered. It's a very vast subject, and I have managed to shed but a small fraction of light on it. And you can see it's very multidimensional in its aspect. So today we will cover a few more things, and hopefully you're starting to get a hint. And my hope is that you will walk away with at least this slight understanding of this vast science, and to be able to look at your clients and patients, or anybody, you know, because everybody that we meet is suffering in one way or another, but to look at them and to start to engage all your senses in every manner possible, and to leverage and utilize all this information and tools in your toolkit as practitioners or aspiring practitioners of Ayurveda. All right, so today we will touch on the concept of time briefly. Again, the Vedas and the Vedic sciences, the concept of time can be broken out. That would be a several-hour lecture, but just for the purposes of this, we will touch on it briefly. And so hopefully you're seeing the slides okay. So time, or kala, kala purusha, we heard that term as Lord Mahavishnu being represented, a personification of time, because that's what jyotish is really, because time is a concept that we need as human beings in our very linear comprehension of things to make sense of reality, which is really a series of events from 1 second to the next, from 1 minute to the next, because that's the only way we can perceive our reality, right? In fact, time and space are simply concepts. If you took away the concept of time and space, just imagine what would really reality look like? And for some of us, or many of you perhaps, who have a very consistent meditation practice, many of you may have experienced that state where time and space disappears and you just are. And it's a really profound sensation that just cannot be described, but it's something to be experienced, right? So going back to the concept of time, because we're looking at life in a series, a sequence of events, we're looking at cause and effect in every moment, right? And we know that karma is the law of cause and effect along this concept of linear time. And time represents life cycles, changes for us, right? The aging process from birth to death. We plant a seed, the seed grows into a tree, you know, we do something and then this happens and so on. And in some cases, we won't even be able to see the effect of an action, maybe until years later, right? And in many cases, many diseases fall into that category, right? Things, if we've led a very lifestyle, then we see the effects of it much later in life. So cause is some event or action, and the result of that action is the effect of that cause. So you can say it another way: cause reveals the effect contained within it, or cause is really effect that is unmanifested. And in turn, we can say when we see the effect of a cause, that it is cause manifested. Now, I know that's, for some of us, it may take a little bit of time to grasp or wrap our minds around that, but just think about it. Again, think about the fact that time is a concept, right? So Vedic astronomy, along the backgrounds of jyotish, describes kala as consciousness time. And that's a really interesting concept, because we're all just pure consciousness. We're beings that have manifested into consciousness from the supreme consciousness. And so time can be described and actually in the Vedic sciences and Vedic astronomy, time is actually described in very small quantum units at subquantum levels. And I mean at the subatomic levels, at the string level. And we know that in the world of physics, string theory it's an infancy of being grasped, right? Whereas the Vedic sciences have described this millennia ago, right? And so time at the measurement of the vibration at the string level, at the subquantum level of an atom has been measured. And the astronomy also refers to time in cosmological units in billions of years. And if you just Google, even on Wikipedia, the Hindu units of time, you'll have this extensive layout of how time is laid out. So for our purposes, just for understanding, we can describe time from the moment that prana takes hold of a being, and we start to measure prana in units of respiration, because remember, as we're born, it is at the time of our birth, that is the first time we are connecting to the energy of earth, and that's where our existence of consciousness begins. So time is described in measures of the units of respiration by 4 seconds, if you will. So moving on again, in concepts of time, the term paramanu exists, and that really describes, you can imagine, 60,750th of a second. So you can see the sophistication of the Vedic sciences, that they start to describe time down to such minuscule units that we can't even begin to comprehend. So you can appreciate how the ancient sages and seers and the wisdom of the Vedas comes through. You will hear of the term muhurta. And the term muhurta has many meanings, of course, but in the concept of time, it describes a segment of 48 minutes. And as a subset of the term muhurta, you will hear the term gati, and that is described in 24 minutes. And so in the Vedic concepts of time, one day and one night is described as one ahoratra. And so if you look at the breakdown of ahoratra, if you take away the a and the tra at the end, you have the word hora, right, which describes your astrology, if you will, as a whole. So the concept of one mas, or 1 month, describes 28 to 30 ahoratra. Now, here's a fine distinction. So in most parts, so what you divide a month either by the lunar month, the period or duration of when the moon goes through the constellations, and also we measure time as in concepts of a month or a masa, depending on how the sun travels through the constellations. And interestingly, in most of India, most North India, midsection of India and onwards, starts to measure months as far as lunar months. And again, this is information you can find on Google and Wikipedia. Whereas in South India, and mostly in the states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, we go by the solar months. So when the sun is in Aries, we refer to that as a month of Mesha. When the sun is in Taurus, we refer to that as a month of Vrishabha, and so on. Whereas The moon moving through the constellations makes up a whole different set of months, so on. And so you can imagine that there's a little bit of difference in how the time may line up. And so the importance of the moon cycles, as you know, the moon waxes and wanes, right? And so in the concepts of time, we also look at the waxing phase of the moon and the waning phase of the moon. And then the other concept of time, each season of the year, each ritu cycle of the year is measured in 2 masas each, and I'll get into that a little bit later. You also will hear of, and I don't want to read all of this slide here, you can just read through it, I'm just trying to show you a breakdown of time. But for our purposes, and I'll get into the concept of Tithi and Muhurta a little bit further down in the presentation, but one Muhurta, which I indicated is 48 minutes, is made up of 2 ghatis, which are each of 24 minutes, okay? Now, the term muhurta also indicates an auspicious time. So in a given day, there's usually up to about 30 muhurta. And some of it is maybe bad muhurta, some of it is good muhurta, depending on your asterism, depending on your lagna, depending on what's going on with you, depending on what major period, the planetary period you're going through, etc. And so we look at specific muhurta to start treatments, but we look at muhurta for weddings, we look at muhurta for specific sacred ceremonies, initiations, giving mantras, all of those things. So all those become important in what time of day, what day it is, what moment it is even, because remember, Vedic time can be broken down into the absolute nanosecond, if you will, and even in terms of seconds, even lesser than nanoseconds. And so the other name, as you go through some research that you will hear, is the Varahamita sage. Sage Varahamita actually wrote and described extensive treatises on time. So what we need to understand is the movement of the planets are described through the movement of time. So each ghati of the day, or each 24-minute portion of the day, describes how a planet and as the lord of a Rashi goes through that Rashi or goes through the day. And that's how the names of the days have been derived, per the lord that rules the first ghati of the day. So in our example, sun, Surya rules the first 24 minutes of Sunday, and so we give the, Sunday is known as Ravivar, or the day ruled by Surya. Similarly, moon rules the first ghati of Monday, so it is referred to as Moon Day or Somavar, and so on. So Mars rules Tuesday, Buddha, Mercury, rules Wednesday, Jupiter, Guru, rules Thursday, Venus, Shukra, rules Friday, and Saturday is ruled by Saturn. And then Rahu and Ketu, of course, don't have days because they actually depict eclipses of the sun and the moon, respectively. And just as a side note, today is a new moon day, so the moon is in a dark phase, and I will show you what that means in a pictorial here coming up. And then there's a couple of other significances as well. We're also getting ready to get into a solar eclipse tomorrow, so you have to be mindful of the energies. And many of you already are in touch with your energetic bodies, and you can start to feel the sensation. I, for one, am extremely, extremely sensitive to planetary changes and moon changes. Like, I can feel it in my body, I can feel it in my mind, and I immediately know what's kind of going on. I usually have to look up at the calendar or the ephemeris to kind of figure this out. But start to inculcate or develop that sense, that energetic sense within you, that ultra sense, right? Not just your normal sights and smell and taste, but really that extra sense of feeling how you feel in your body with the movement of the planets. So talking about transits and movements of planets, right? Every celestial body, every planet is in transit. And transit simply means a movement or a change in every moment of time. And what that translates to is really a reflection of internal changes of alchemy within our body, right? That planetary change simply translates into how it is a change within our energetic structure on the planet Earth. And so, you know, most farmers follow the intelligence of the movement of the celestial planets. When we plant vegetables, when we plant our garden, we should be mindful of what time of day and what transits we're in when we plant those things, right? Life cycles, birth, death, regeneration, all the seasons, winter, spring, summer, are all dictated by transits, right? So in the planetary world, the slowest moving planet is Saturn. And Saturn takes a period of over 30 months to go from one Rashi into the next. The fastest moving planet we know is Mercury. And from the Earth's perspective, really, Moon is the fastest moving celestial body, even though the Moon is not necessarily considered a planet in the scientific world, but from Jyotish, we consider Moon as a planet. And so Moon is the fastest moving planet as far as we're concerned, and then comes Mercury. So everybody goes through these transits under these planetary periods, experiencing the effects of the planets. And then and I'll get into the details of this a little bit later in another slide, and in each major planetary period where you feel the transition, and I'm not saying that all of us are experiencing the same planetary period, that's not it at all. We each may be experiencing a different planetary period, a major period in that transit in our lives. And so, however, but at a micro level, we all experience a transit of the moon. So for today, for example, it's the new moon. We, as women especially, should be feeling the transit of the new moon. So I don't know if Monica G has any comments on this, but somewhere in an ancient text many, many years ago I had read, and I wish I could remember what the text was exactly, where the reference is. But if you think of the pull of the full moon, we know that the full moon pulls on tides of the earth, and we experience low tides in the waning phases of the moon. Similarly, it has an effect on the fluids and the circulation in our body. So as women, most women should be ovulating during the full moon and having their menstrual cycles at the new moon, where there's a shedding, so to speak. And if Monica G has a specific reference for it, I would love to see it in the ancient texts or anywhere for that matter. We also look at the transits of the moon through the 27 asterisms, and I'll get into the nakshatras, the asterisms, a little bit later, very briefly. The one transit that many of you will hear about, and I've mentioned this in earlier lectures, is the 7.5 period of Saturn. And even in Western astrology, people refer to this as Saturn's return. It's not exactly the same concept as Western astrology. In Jyotish, we refer to Saturn's return when Saturn has come back to the house right before your moon. So wherever your moon is in whichever Rashi in your natal chart, when Saturn arrives at the house right before it, which is the 12th house from the moon, that's when the 7.5-year period of Saturn begins, or we refer to it as a Sade-Sat, 7.5-year period. And this is very feared. It's like held in a lot of, sort of this very negative light. And it's very unfortunate because it's really about bringing us into restrictions so that we become authentic as people, as authentic as the representations of that supreme self, right? For us to not overreact and not be highly dramatic and not be highly emotional, but rather really respect and honor who we are as people. And that's what Saturn does. And that's, many of us will experience the pressures of life in many ways, like a chokehold being put on us during the 7.5-year period of Saturn. And this usually occurs, as you can imagine, in periods of 30 years in everybody's lives, right? So everybody at least experiences two, at least depending on your lifespan, of course, at least two if not 3 7.5-year periods of Saturn. And people usually say there's a saying, if you've gone through 3 of the 7.5-year periods of Saturn, then you will have become enlightened because you will have gotten rid of all your extra baggage. Okay, so just one little question just for you guys to think about. So why the moon? Can anybody just kind of quickly give me, why do we place such an emphasis on when Saturn comes before the moon? What does the moon represent? Any thoughts? I'm not, okay. So the moon really represents our mind, right? Our emotional, that's correct, our perception, our mental nature. And so if our mental nature is off track, if we're always looking at life from a very emotional way, then we're really failing to see reality. So what I mean by that is something may be concerning us. Okay, if our child is sick, yes, that is of concern. But should we run around pulling our hair out and being overtly emotional? That doesn't help, right? Because it prevents us from taking practical action to address our child's sickness. So whatever traumas or whatever issues, they may be real, but it's how our mental approach is to that issue that becomes paramount. And so hence the moon, we're always experiencing life and reality from our manasa, our moon. And hence any planetary impact on the moon kind of shows us the lessons of how we should be experiencing reality from the perspective of that planet. No problem, Dilek. Thank you. Appreciate you texting. I don't want you to text while you're driving, clearly. Okay, so to get into the Mahadasha, or the major planetary periods, and I touched on this briefly, I believe, in the last lecture. So I had given you guys a table of how the major planetary periods exert its effects and for how long. And so the sun is for 6 years, the moon is for 10 years, Mars is for 7 years, Rahu is for 18 years, and so on. Venus is 20 years, and so on. And if you don't remember this, please go back to the previous lecture slide presentation, and you'll see this table. What I want to focus on is within each major planetary period, there are also sub-planetary periods. So within, let's say, the example of the sun major planetary period, which is of 6 years, you will start to experience the sub-planetary period of the sun within the sun major period. Then you will experience the moon sub-period within the sun major period. Then you will experience Mars sub-period in the moon's major period, and so on. And each of these are referred to as antardashas, or the inside dashas, or the sub-dashas. And then again, that's broken down even further in concepts of time. Within the sun-sun period, you will experience sun, sun, and moon. Within sun-moon, you will experience sun, moon, etc. So down to the very day, if you are, let's say, in your sun major period, you can actually look at today and see which planetary period is governing your day today. And that's really fascinating, because once you start to get a sense of that, you start to see, well, how did my day go today? When you start to go into that place of introspection, down to even the minute of the day, you can start to see which planet within the major planetary period exerts its effect. The other thing we need to be mindful of is during specific major planetary periods, many of us can experience the effects of it in big ways, whether it's we buy a house, whether we get married, whether it's relationships, or it also describes phases of illness. So we could have, if you're in your Venus major period, for example, you can experience gains and pleasures and marriage and sensuality and sexuality and travels and all of these sensual things, but it can also indicate reproductive and sexual illnesses, or even venereal diseases, right? Similarly, if you're in your Mercury major period, if Mercury is not placed well in your chart, you could perhaps experience a nervous system related illness or asthma, if you will. And same thing for Rahu, for example. You can experience severe mental stresses, delusions, and skin diseases even. Saturn can indicate musculoskeletal issues, depression, large intestine issues, all kinds of Vata issues because he is a Vata planet. So start to look at associating physiology to the planets. And if somebody's experiencing a chronic illness or disease for long periods of time, we can start to make some correlations of what planet may be governing that illness. So getting into the moon tithi, the phases of the moon, the word tithi is simply describing a lunar phase or a lunar day, if you will. And really, it just describes the distance between the moon and sun each day. And on this visual, I hope you can see how as the moon orbits around the Earth and as how the Earth orbits around the sun, you're going to have different phases of the moon. So we know that the moon takes roughly about 28 to 29 days to kind of go around the Earth. And so you have one set of 14 days or 14 and a half days that is in the waxing fortnight, which is the Shukla Paksha, and then the waning fortnight, which is when the moon starts to go towards the new moon, which is where we are right now in Krishna Paksha. And each day, within each of these fortnights, within each 14 and a half day period, you have each day that describes what phase that the moon is in. Again, I don't want to read through all of these, but these are Sanskrit terms like Pratipada is the first day, Dvitya is the second day, Tritiya is the third day, Chaturthi is the fourth day, and so on. And many of us are familiar with Ekadashi, which is the 11th day of the moon phase. And so in Vedic culture, especially in the Vaishnavite school of devotion, or that part of worshiping the supreme consciousness, Ekadashi is extremely important in keeping part of lifestyle in every moment. So you would fast from all rice and grains on that day. You would minimize the amount of food that you take on that day. And actually, I know many of my family members who actually don't even drink a drop of water on that day until they wait till the next day. They actually start the day prior to, then they fast all of Ekadashi, and then they go to a Krishna temple or a Vishnu temple the following morning, and then they will take sips of water at the temple and eat the prasad at the temple to break their fast. So there are some people who are very, very stringent about this. Some people do fruits, just only fruits and milk. Some people vary, so it's a personal choice. And so on and so forth. So then the 15th day is usually the full moon, Paurnima or Purnima as we call it, or in the waning fortnight, it is in the new moon cycle, which is Amavasya. And so on an Amavasya day, which is new moon such as today, we typically would not undertake anything auspicious. A new action, a new beginning is not something perhaps you would start on a new moon day. And you can see from this pictorial, the moon and the sun are exactly conjunct with each other, which is why we don't see the moon from an Earth perspective, right? But another thing I'd like for you guys to think about is start to observe your breath on each day of the phase of the lunar cycle. And there's this extensive and amazing science of yoga called Swara Yoga that deals with the science and art of breathing and how breath governs your physiology, right? And so just every morning when you wake up, just hold your hand up to your nose. As soon as you wake up, see which channel has the most breath. Is it your right side? Is it your left side? What does the breath feel like? And then start to get a sensation, where is that breath flowing? Because even in your nostrils, you have the 5 elements represented through the channels of your nostrils, and you can start to feel, well, is that breath going through the earth center, through the water center, through the air center? A whole nother topic of discussion, right? But please start to get in touch with your breath as part of the lunar cycle, just to bring a sense of self-awareness. Okay, so then getting into the concept of drishti, or the aspects of agraha. So what does drishti mean? Drishti means gaze, and for many of you who practice yoga, you know that drishti in an asana, for example, is extremely important, because what does drishti do? It actually increases the energetic effect of an asana. right? In many poses and for different Prakriti types, your gaze needs to either be at the horizon or downward or upward to increase that Agni in the body, to increase the effect of that asana in the body. And if you haven't been doing it, I encourage you to start considering the effect of drishti. Make it a very focused and purposeful and intentional gaze in your yoga practice as you go through. And you'll start to get the sense of the energetic sense of sight as you feel that in your body. So similarly, in jyotish, all grahas have a specific gaze upon other planets or other rashis. So every planet in a chart aspects the 7th house from itself. So what I mean by that is if the moon is sitting in Taurus, for example, that is house 1 for the moon. And from the moon, you would count 7 houses. So it would be Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio. And so Scorpio would be the 7th house from Taurus. And so the moon will always have a gaze on Scorpio. I hope that makes sense. So it's almost like the moon is sort of the supervisor kind of glancing at the 7th house always from itself to make sure things are going okay, or whatever the influence of the moon is in your chart, it will have that specific effect on that 7th house. Every planet has a gaze on the 7th house from itself. Now, there are 3 planets that have special aspects, extra aspects in addition to the 7th house aspect. Mars looks at the 4th house and the 8th house from itself, in addition to the 7th house. Jupiter, and if you think about this, the 4th house and the 8th house are actually regarded as sort of malefic houses, and I've described this in the Bhava lecture from before, so please go back and make that correlation for yourself. Jupiter looks at the 5th house and the 9th house of dharma from itself, in addition to the 7th house. Saturn looks at the 3rd house and the 10th house of karma from itself, in addition to the 7th house from itself. So when we look at a person's chart, now you're beginning to get one more dimensional layer you have to add when you analyze your chart or somebody else's chart. So you start to look at aspects and how the influence of those planets are on a person's health or their behavior or, you know, their personality and so on. And of course, in addition to that, you would also take today's chart, like the current position and placement of planets, and add that as an overlaying layer on top of your chart. And I think I mentioned that in a previous lecture. Again, I realize this is a very complicated concept. It's, you know, it's going to take some time to wrap your head around. Take your time. It's a skill that takes years to develop, to start to look at all these layers, to start looking at your chart in this very multi-dimensional way. So in concepts of time, I mentioned this, graha, all the planets also govern ritu, the seasons of the year. So in the Brihad Parashara Hora Shastra, the quote is from verses 43 to 46, in the nature of the grahas, Venus's ritu is Vasanta, of Mars and the Sun is Grishma, Moon is Varsha, Mercury is Sharad, and Hemanta is known to be of Jupiter, and Saturn is Shishira. So, as I said before, each season is a period of time that is fixed for 2 solar months. 2 months make up 1 season. So Saturn rules the coldest part of the year, which is usually around end of December, January through March timeframe, right? Saturn is a cold planet. It is the most distant planet from us. And remember, I didn't say this, so many people think that Vedic astrologers don't consider Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, and that's hardly the truth. The ancient sages in Parashara knew of those planets and galaxies well beyond. To them, they just looked at it that they were too distant to exert its influence in any real way on the human body from a geocentric perspective. However, there are very subtle energetic effects, but they just focused on the planetary, the celestial bodies that had the most effects on the human, on the planet Earth, right? So when the sun, going back to Saturn ruling the coldest part of the year, January through March, sun is usually in the Capricorn Rashi and the Aquarius Rashi. Similarly, in the season of Vasanta, which is springtime, which is where we're entering now, Venus governs this season, and the sun starts to move into Pisces and then subsequently into Aries, and that's when we have spring. Grishma, which is starts to get warmer, sun moves into Taurus and Gemini. So like this, I don't want to, again, read through all of it. The main thing being here, if a planet indicates an illness, then there will be a problem during the season that is governed by that graha. So, Kristen, to answer your question, yes. So gazing on another house, more specifically the Rashi, right? So when you look, so if the moon is sitting in Gemini, then it's going to be looking at the the Sagittarius Rashi, which is the 7th house from it. So yes, you would look at the 7th house from it on another house. So the moon has an influence in the house that it is sitting in, and it also has an influence on the house that it gazes at. Now, the effects may be different. It could have positive effects. It could have negative effects. It could have neutral effects. It could have very positive, ultra-benefic effects. Okay, so from a perspective of illness and physiology, we look at a client to see, well, many chronic illnesses, so Ayurveda and even Chinese medicine talk about this, many chronic illnesses start to rear its head during the shift in seasons, right, at the Ritu Sandhi, or the conjunction of seasons. So it's really important for us to kind of say, or observe, which planet may be governing an illness. So, for example, we know in the colder periods, in the colder seasons, people who have arthritis and joint troubles start to flare up with their arthritis or rheumatoid, kind of that sort of muscly joint pain kind of thing. Well, Saturn rules that, and so Saturn, in the season of Saturn, would flare up those kind of imbalances. Does that make sense? Okay. Great. Again, this is just a recap of Kala Purusha in your physiology. We've covered this as a picture of Lord Mahavishnu with each Rashi covering the head, face, arms, heart, stomach, etc. I found this really cool visual. I thought would be very helpful to look at it from a South Indian chart and a North Indian chart perspective, so you could see. Again, this is from a perspective of the natural zodiac. So in your natal chart, whichever your first house is, that would govern your head. Then the second house would govern the face, the third arms, the third would be arms, and so on and so forth. So you can try to look at this from a perspective, again, and overlay on your chart. Okay. I wanted to kind of share this, and again, this is from the text of the Phala Deepika from chapter 2, verse 28. Graha rules the greens, right? And again, because we deal with Ahara, I wanted to add this slide in. So the sun rules wheat. Now, we know that the sun is a krura graha, which is a cruel planet. It's nature. It is a fiery planet. It burns everything. So wheat requires more digestion, right? Again, bringing a sense of awareness to food. Moon rules rice. And moon is a saumya graha, a soothing, calming, nourishing graha. Okay, so therefore rice is very tridoshic. Rice is very cooling and nourishing for you. Mars rules pigeon peas and red lentils, right? Again, Mars is a krura graha. So when might you consume red lentils, for example? Would you consume it in the summer, or would you consume it in the winter, right? You would, that's correct. You would consume it in the winter, or when you needed the heat, that kind of strong heat of Mars to be developed in you. But you wouldn't give it to someone whose digestion is so poor, where it's going to take even more time to digest. Unfortunately, in India, what I notice is in different parts of the country, people overconsume without any regard to season sometimes, right? There are people who pay attention to which lentils and which grains you should eat during different seasons. So in the colder weather, they will eat the harder grains to give them more warmth and so on. And in the cooler weather, they will refrain from eating those grains, right? So Mercury rules Moondal. Great, right? Mercury is a benefic planet. It's great and nourishing for all weaknesses, right? Jupiter rules chickpea, garbanzo, beneficial for sugar imbalances. Venus rules hyacinth bean. And I don't know how many of you have seen this. There's a beautiful picture actually on Google. It's very purplish red. It's not very commonly used, but it increases the strength of all organs, especially the kidneys. And if you look at the shape of that bean and the color of that bean, you'll know what I mean. Saturn rules sesame seeds. Great for immune disorders and vata disorders, but not in excessive amounts, right? Just enough to consume to give you that energy and to help boost your immune system. Ketu rules horsegram, or kulti as it's called. So horsegram is very, very kind of, it really takes a stronger Agni to digest horsegram, so it's not given to everybody, but it's used in where diseases are crystallized. So for kidney stones, gallstones, bone spurs, when you have a person who's very rigid and who's always like complaining and whiny and all of that, you kind of give them horsegram to kind of take their mind away from focusing on all those ill feelings, right? Dilek, kidney bean, not specifically, but I would all say that it may be ruled by Venus because, even in Chinese medicine, kidney beans are used to nourish the kidneys. So my personal guess, this is not, I don't have anything to attest to from the text at all. Maybe Monica G does. But I might venture a guess and say perhaps Venus. Again, kidney bean is a little harder to digest, but definitely you could make soups of it and maybe just drink the water when you have kidney weakness, perhaps, right? Rahu rules urad dal, or the black gram that's used in idlis and dosas and, the South Indian foods. Again, you would use that for overactive, hyperactive behavior, but excessive use of urad dal can bring about tamas. It can bring about laziness. It's very heavy. You wouldn't eat it. We always combine those lentils with rice, 1-to-2 ratio when we make those dishes like idli and dosa and so on, because we know that it's a very heavy grain. So the basic suggestion is to limit the grains that are ruled by the krura grahas, by the cruel grahas, except to strengthen the body. Okay, another concept I wanted to touch on very quickly is the yoga of planets. Again, this is a very complex concept. Again, just giving you a sense of awareness. When planets come together, they form a yoga, a union, and there are specific rules that govern it. Your Lagna Bhava, your first house, is the most important. That is what defines who you are, your personality, who you are when you decided to meet Earth, in a physical way. And all your other houses are from the perspective of the first house. So then you start to look at, well, who's the ruler of my first house? And the power of that planet, and who's looking where, and what relationships does the ruling planet of your Lagna have with other Rashis in your chart? So you have to start looking at that. So for example, if you are a Gemini ascendant, Mercury is the Lord of Gemini, right, of Gemini Rashi. What does the relationship of Mercury look like in the 10th house? So what is its relationship in Pisces, which is a 10th house from it? Well, Mercury is in debility in the 10th house. Well, what does that mean? Well, perhaps it could mean that we may have trouble making good judgments in terms of responsibility and career, which is what the 10th house represents, right? And that's just a very small and gross example. That's just kind of giving you an awareness of how the effect and union and relationships of planets in relationship to all the other Rashis in your chart has. So we also look to see which planet is the strongest in your chart. And so remember in our first lecture, I talked to you about how we have the bhavas of kama, artha, dharma, moksha, etc., right? We also look at houses called the kona bhavas, and the Kendra Bhavas. And this visual here kind of gives you an idea. It's very easy to look at, and this is why I like to look at the North Indian chart, because it's very easy to look at the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th, whereas it's not so apparent in the South Indian chart. Whereas in the South Indian chart, you can actually look at the Kona houses, which is the 1st, 5th, and 9th house, which are your dharma houses, and it leads to the fulfillment of your life's purpose. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is typically we look to see, well, how are the planetary relationships with these houses and its rulers and so on. Again, another layer that we put on, right, a superimposing layer. And if there's any relationships, whether they're positive or positive, between the Kendra houses and the Kona houses, those are the most powerful planets in your chart. And again, just as an exercise, when you go back and you analyze your chart or somebody else's chart, please feel free, if you're so moved, to look at the relationships of the lords of your 1st house, 4th house, 7th house, 10th house, or your 1st, 5th, and 9th, and look at the relationships and see if those planets have any kind of relationships, right? Again, lots of math formulas behind it. It's not very straightforward. You can start to see the connections. They can be in the same sign together. They can aspect each other. They can have drishti on each other. They may have other relationships from each other and so on. Okay, so and I'm going to barely touch on Vastu. Just as Jyotish is the personification of time, the Kala Purusha, Vastu is the personification of space, because both time and space are a part of our current reality. And so in Vastu, you know, the directional aspects, the 8 directions and the 10 directions all come into play. And just the only pointer, if there's one takeaway that you can take away from it, examine from your space perspective, from the place of your physiology, which way you're sleeping in your room. Your head should never point north when you're resting. And if you think about it, one way to think about it is the Earth's magnetic north and your magnetic north should never line up, because if you think about the energies moving out of your head, right, you're always going to be restless. You're never going to feel rested. That is the only takeaway I want you to remember. Vastu is a much more complicated science, and I think we will be covering this later on in the year. I believe I saw an email from Monica G saying that we would be covering Vastu later on. Okay, so touching on nakshatras real quick, again, a very complex concept. There are 27 lunar constellations, right? Again, another layer, another multidimensional layer of looking at your chart. So the nakshatra is just one more layer of that chart. So from the Rashi of Aries all the way to Pisces, the moon, we know, transits one day at a time in each of those Rashis. Each Rashi, in the 360-degree circle of the zodiac, each Rashi takes up 30 degrees of a section. So Aries is 30 degrees, Taurus is 30 degrees, Gemini is 30 degrees, etc. Within each Rashi, there are nakshatras. It's the actual constellation of stars that are divided into 4 quarters of, so let me just say this, let me back up. So each nakshatra within a Rashi takes up 13 degrees and 20 minutes within each Rashi, okay? And then again, dividing that nakshatra even further, that nakshatra is divided into 4 quarters. And the only reason I'm mentioning nakshatras is each one of you are born into a nakshatra. At the time of your birth, you were born into one subsection of that nakshatra. And as you can see from this visual, some nakshatras span 2. So there are nakshatras like, let's say like Mrigashira, for example, that span the Taurus Rashi as well as the Gemini Rashi, for example. So you would need to know which nakshatra you were born in and which Rashi you were born in, because the Rashi you're born in shows you the Lagna, your 1st house. So then you can hazard a guess, oh, I was born into this nakshatra, possibly one of 2 or 3 nakshatras that fall in this Rashi. And I know this visual is not very clear. There are better images on the internet. I had to try to fit this on the slide without taking up the entire slide. So please feel free to Google the different nakshatras. And the reason I describe this is the characteristics of that nakshatra best describe certain characteristics of your personality, right? So here's another example. I kind of created this table for you to show you the planetary rulers of each nakshatra. So each planet or each graha rules 3 nakshatras, right? From Ketu, Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury. And you can look at your nakshatra, determine who its planetary lord is, and see how that has an effect on your general personality. Now, why is this important? This ties back to the Mahadasha, the major planetary period that you're in. So when you're born, the planetary lord of that nakshatra will be the first planetary major period that you're going to be born into. Now, again, as I said in the previous lecture, you're not going to start at the very beginning of that planetary major period. It depends on which degree that the moon was in your nakshatra at the time of your birth to determine whether you get some portion of that planetary major period. Again, one more layer. And usually what I do is when I talk to my clients, I ask them, how old they are. I look at their birth date. So I kind of have a sense of what major period that they're in, even just by looking at them, right? So just another tool for you to start engaging, looking at the gender of the nakshatra, looking at the symbol of that nakshatra, kind of figuring out, oh, okay, how does this correlate symbolically with the way this person is, okay? All right, moving on. Panchanga. Again, I'm not going to be able to do so much justice to this. The Panchanga is the almanac, or the ephemeris, if you will. Now, most astrologers and farmers use an almanac to see, okay, where's the moon, what is the season, where are the tides, etc. In jyotish, we use the Panchanga as our almanac to determine where the planets and the celestial bodies are, what are the phases of the moon, what day and time is auspicious, where are the muhurtas, and so on. So the thing that I want you to remember, and Panchanga means 5 limbs, or 5 attributes of the time of day, okay? And you look at the Tithi, the lunar day, the nakshatra, the yoga, the karana, which is the half lunar day, the Tithi broken down into 2, which kind of determines what is a good muhurta for your action. And then Vara, which is the weekday, whether it's a Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Fridays are considered gentle days, and Tuesdays, Sundays, and Saturdays are considered cruel days. Okay, and I'll show you an example here. The reason you would want to start to look at this, again, this is part of your toolkit, to start at a minimum looking at the nakshatras that the moon is in for that day and what phase of the moon that the moon is in. Is it in the waxing phase? Is it a new moon? Is it a full moon? Is it in the 3rd phase of the moon? And so on. You follow the panchang for your day, for your time, for your land. So I know that some people look, many Indians for some reason tend to look at the panchang for India. Well, that makes no sense, right? You're not living in India. If you're living in Seattle, or if you're living in California, or if you're living in Michigan, you're going to look at the panchang because when you look up at the skies, the moon and all the planets are in a different position than it is if you were in India. So there's lots of software and calendars available on the web that you can follow for your time and place. And it's based on more importantly, it's based on the sunrise and sunset times for your land and place. So we know that India is kind of at the moment 12.5 hours or 12 hours ahead of where we are on the West Coast, for example. So it would make no sense for us to look at the panchang for India when we are in our daytime and it's already nighttime in India and the sun has already set. So just giving you a quick example here. Here's an example. Again, if you go to the website, there's many websites. I tend to use this one, www.mypanchang.com, and you can put in your, it's very busy, by the way, and this is actually developed by a priest here in the Seattle area. They have a temple down in Renton, south of here from Seattle, and he developed this calendar. It's used by a lot of people now, which is great. And And so when you plug in your city and state and, it comes up with the time. So in this case, this is just a snapshot of the Panchanga for Seattle. And you can see Thursday, you'll see the white circle that indicates it was a full moon. And what I want you to kind of notice here is just look at the Tithi, which is indicated by the T. It tells you the phase of the moon. The N indicates the nakshatra of the moon. And when you look at where the sun is and where the moon is, it tells you which constellation it is in. So sun here is now in Aquarius, and so it's actually moving into Pisces here. I believe we're already moved into Pisces. And so you would also look to see where is the moon sitting. So those are the things that you can start to train your mind to look at. So I have a printout that's hanging on my kitchen cabinet, and that's the first thing I look at as soon as I turn on my stove fire. I go look at the calendar and I see, okay, what is the phase of the moon? And I kind of start to keep that in mind, what nakshatra and so on that we're in. Okay, so very quickly, some client assessment tips. Again, tools, right? I'm just giving you guys some tools to add into your toolkit to increase your awareness. I'm not expecting you guys to be experts at this. It will take time. So just start to practice, right? One bit at a time. So when you look at a client, you do your intake form. You're going to get their birth date, so you kind of know what month and day that they're born in. And remember, in the very first lecture, I kind of gave you that table. You'll know where the sun Rashi is. Just right off the top of your bat, that is something you can train yourself to do. And then if you have access to that little software link that I sent you, you can plug in the client's time and see what nakshatra that they're in. So you can kind of see, okay, here's the characteristics of the nakshatra. Here's how does this correlate to the client that I'm observing. And then you can also start to look to see, well, which phase of the moon were they born in? Were they born in the Shukla Paksha? Were they born in the Krishna Paksha? Were they born on a full moon? Were they born on a new moon? All that starts to give you an indication, well, here's the client's mental state, right? How does this translate to my client who's standing in front of me? You can also look at their lagna, their ascendant, right? You can say, okay, by looking at their face and their head, you can start to correlate. When we do the darshana, looking at their forehead, looking at their eyes, looking at their cheeks, looking at their tongue, looking at their nose and their nostrils, their chin, you start to associate all those things that you learned from darshana and incorporate that into the little bits and pieces that you now have learned about jyotish. And then start to examine the illness and the symptoms that they're presenting. What planet governs that illness? Who is the seizing planet here for that illness? You also start to look at the 6th, 8th, and 12th houses, the Rashi, the rulers of that Rashi, and the planets occupying these houses. And for yourself, just analyze, how does this planet have an implication or an influence on my client, right? And then you can also start to see, are these planets in exaltation? Are they in debility? And so on. So the idea here is I'm giving you all these things to start looking at your client using that wide-angle lens, right? That panoramic view of your patient and your clients. Or some of you may be doing workshops. Start to look at each person who steps in front of you with that broad picture of them and start to develop that awareness within your sense. And practice. That's all I can say. And stay humble. Know that the science is so vast. There are no quick routes. Practice. Take anybody's chart. Look at sample charts on the internet and start practicing. And then one last thing I wanted to mention, remedial measures. Upaya is the word. And I have a lot of people saying, well, what should I do here, right? To me, the best remedial measure you can do is within yourself, right? The internal alchemy. And I had touched on this briefly. I have people who come and say, well, should I wear this gemstone or this, that? I am not a big proponent of that. Matter of fact, the ancient texts, there is one verse in the Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. Any text before the 12th century did not have references to gemstones, but all they indicate is gray from Rahu, black gem from Ketu. That's it. The colors associated with the Rashi and not even the planet, right? So there are texts that have been written since the 12th century that actually refer to gemstones and so on. Again, that's a personal preference. We can look at the colors. So Venus rules all things white, as does the moon. Moon kind of goes into pink gemstones and so on. Again, it's a personal preference. I don't want to get into it. But to me, the best thing that you can do is prayer, that connection with your higher self. Chanting the name of whichever aspect that you resonate with, right? Of Lord Vishnu, of Krishna, of any deity that you resonate with, doing the japa. But maybe that is perhaps more pertinent to the graha that has seized you, right? Meditation. The best practice of Raja Yoga, to know yourself. It is introspection. You're going into the light within yourself through meditation. And Karma Yoga, service to others in the form of the Lord, is the best service. Rituals and ceremonies that you can do for yourself, right? Lighting a lamp every day to light up your consciousness within. And in all of these things, focus is important. You can start to focus on Jupiter. You can start to focus on Saturn. You can start to focus on the moon and just pray, right? And say, please help me through this time. Help me receive the message that you're trying to tell me, right? Those are the remedial measures that I would best recommend. And to finish, and right on time, there is nothing higher than dharma. Verily, that which is dharma is the truth. Moksha is the realization of this truth and results in freedom from rebirth. And this is from the Vedas. So I realize I've gone at like light speed. So yes, so recommendations on books, I will definitely post that on the forum. Some of the books out there can get very technical, and that's why I've kind of held off on sort of knowing about this. Having been mentored by Dr. Robert Swoboda, Light on Life is one book that he has co-written with Hart Defoe, who's an amazing astrologer. Mantri Ji, as he's called, he's in Toronto. That's one book you can start with, but I will find some easier books and try to list them on the forum. So thank you all for bearing with me, and I appreciate your patience and your curiosity. Thank you very much, and I hope that this has benefited you in some small way. Does anyone have any questions that I can answer? There's probably so much you have to wrap around. Thank you all. If you have questions, please post them on the forum. I am traveling to India tomorrow, and I'll try to check the forum as much as my internet connectivity will allow. So please bear with me if my responses are delayed. Thank you all. I really appreciate you being part of this forum and just listening to me.